The Lifestyle Show, presented by Selina MacKenzie.
Now, in the book of The Ambition Penalty, journalist Stefanie O'Connell presents a deeply researched and sometimes shocking look at the ways women remain passed over and excluded, and not for a lack of ambition, but because of it. She calls it the ambition penalty, the sum of the financial, personal and professional costs women face for daring to want more. Great to have you on the show with us, Stefanie.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So what made you decide to write this book then?
Well, I had been reporting on women in the workplace and their financial outcomes, their access to wealth. And one thing that became very clear to me through that reporting and research was that women were doing all of the right things, quote unquote, and yet they were still facing the same unequal outcomes, making less than their male peers on average, struggling to access leadership positions, struggling to access equal power. And it really made me interrogate what is actually happening here, because for so long, women have been told that they're not accessing equal outcomes because they're not confident enough or ambitious enough or aggressive enough. And yet in case after case, women were asking, they were speaking up, they were asserting themselves, but they weren't getting the same outcomes. And not only that, they were facing backlash for it. They were labeled not a team player, not a good fit, difficult to work with for the exact same behaviors that their male peers could reliably implement to get ahead at work, to get a promotion, to get more pay. And so as I dug into the reporting, I also dug into the research and found that this wasn't just anecdotal. It was borne out in the data. It is not a unique phenomenon of women doing something wrong, but a problem with a system in which you have the same inputs and the outputs are different depending on the identity of the person doing the inputting. And so that's not a personal problem. That's a system problem.
Yeah. I mean, I'm aware that there's still a massive pay gap, which is I think is definitely wrong. But I didn't realise there was such gender equality in the workplace. I mean, in my mind, if you're very good at negotiating, it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman or not, you're right for the job. If you're the right person, the right fit, whether you're male or female, you're right for the job. There shouldn't be any difference, should there? Unless it was maybe a physical job.
Exactly. Well, there's so much of this myth of meritocracy we have all, I think, bought into to a certain extent. The idea that if you're willing to work hard enough and if your performance is right and if the way in which you're qualified is right, it doesn't matter what your identity is. And yet in case after case, in study after study, in industry after industry, you see the same patterns play out. And one of the things that was very interesting, and I dig into the book, is we see how this is playing out a little bit differently now that things like sexism or racism aren't quite as explicit, but they still play out in these kind of covert ways. So one example of that is a paper that looked at why women weren't ascending into leadership positions. And what the researchers found was women were excluded, not because of their gender outright, but instead they had their other identity characteristics weaponized against them through double standards that were not applied to their male peers. So if it was a young woman, she would be excluded for being considered too young to be a leader. If it was an older woman, she would be considered too old, such that there was no right age for women to get ahead. Meanwhile, men would have their age, no matter how young, how old, reframed as assets instead of liabilities. So a young man could be seen as fresh new perspective, the next generation of leadership. And then the older gentleman could be considered a seasoned leader, experienced, just what we need on our team. And so in this paper, the researchers found 30 different kinds of these identity characteristics that were weaponized against women in this way, while also being used at the same time to create more opportunity for their male peers. And so that's just one example of the ways these biases are playing out in the modern context, even as rhetorically they're better hidden.
Yeah. I remember being told years ago, and we are talking a long time ago, that we were shortlisted. It was a sales job, and me and a man were shortlisted, and they couldn't decide. So they went for the man because they thought I was more likely to have to take time off work to have a baby.
Classic example, becoming a parent for men is a career benefit. They become more likely to get ahead at work, more offered support, more flexibility, more pay. Of course, we know it happens for women when they become parents. Often even if they stay as engaged in the workforce, they're still not as able to access the same opportunity, support, pay, promotions. And so I think I really want to be clear. I think in the conversation, we often say, well, it makes sense that women's careers are stalling out in midlife because that's when they become mothers, as though men are not fathers, right? This is not a parenthood issue. This is a gender issue. And I think there has been a little bit of comfort. We've gotten to a place where we see the stats come out year after year. There's still this gap. There's still this kind of outcome. And we explain it away instead of being outraged by it and demanding accountability. And that's what this book is. It's a real reckoning and a call to action to really expose how unjust these systems really are.
We have become equal in the opposite way, haven't we, Stefanie, in that men now get sort of paternity leave, whereas they didn't used to before.
Well, the development of men having access to paternity leave is, I think, a wonderful thing. We know that it's good for families. We know that it's good for children. We know that it's also good for women. When men partake more equitably in the home, women's well-being improves and their professional outcomes improve. And so I think it's a really good example of the kind of framework we should be using for how we think about moving forward. When you talk about paternity leave, for example, that's an environmental shift that enables more equitable outcomes. But so often the conversation about what women can do to access more equal outcomes is not about changing the environment around them. It's telling them that they are the problem and they need to change something within them. And what we're seeing is that's actually kept us stalled out in not being able to move forward in a meaningful way in terms of our outcomes now for decades. But it's the shifts in the environment around us, whether it's paternity leave or more pay transparency or making sure we have more equitable representation in management. And in the book, I use data to show all these interventions that work, but they're really environmental interventions as opposed to internal interventions.
So do you explain in the book what we can do to call out these biases?
Yes. So one of the things that I put in each chapter is the common myths and misconceptions that we hear around women in the workplace. Say something like women don't negotiate and that's why they're underpaid. And then in each chapter, you'll also get the talking points and the data that show exactly why that's a myth and what that myth enables. So for example, in the case of the women don't negotiate myth, we have data now showing that women have been just as likely to negotiate their salaries for over 2 decades. And that has not done anything to close gender pay gaps. But the people who believe the reason that women are underpaid because they do not negotiate are also less likely to support pay equity policies, pay transparency policies, and other policies proven to reduce gender gaps. And so what I think that research really demonstrates to us is that it's not just that women aren't able to access the same rewards for the same behaviors. It's also that the myth in and of themselves that women don't negotiate, for example, even when they do, winds up reducing support for the kinds of policies and practices and increases gender stereotyping, like women aren't confident, that actually drives this inequality in the first place. So much of this book is about busting through these myths and misconceptions because the stereotypes in and of themselves are part of what reproduces inequality, even as other more explicit barriers to women's participation fall away.
It's ridiculous. I mean, the two ones you touched on, women not being confident, that's ridiculous. People sometimes aren't confident, but not. Why would there be unconfident women? And also,
yes,
some of I know people that are the best negotiators in the world and they're women. That's just crazy.
Yes, I think what happens is people really conflate a lot of individual difference for group difference, right? They say, well, I know this one woman or I'm this one guy. And so that's a stand-in. I'm a proxy for all men or all women. And this is not to say there's not a bunch of variation between people as individuals, but when we're talking about a social class as large and as diverse as men versus women, we're not talking about people who are really fundamentally different in terms of things like confidence or ambition or these other traits that often have these very, very strong gendered stereotypes that continue to lock these misconceptions in place.
And I guess it's not just the workplace. If you're a child growing up with a father that, you know, doesn't think women should be ambitious, maybe the mother stays at home and he goes to work, then that child is going to grow up thinking that way, whether it be a boy or a girl.
That's exactly right. And the research bears this out, you know, following what happens to the children as they grow up and they age into their own careers. You know, when boys are raised in households where men are not equitable partners, they also become more likely to not have not participate as equitable partners in the home, which we know is a key contributor to gender inequality outside of the home in the workplace as well. And for mothers, for girls raised by mothers and fathers in that kind of position, you know, those girls will also become less likely to be married to equitable partners themselves, and they will be less likely to be in positions of power in the workplace. So I think a huge focus of this book also is on household inequality, because so much of it underpins workplace inequality and public inequality, but also household inequality often becomes the model by which we learn these stereotypes and these roles of what it means to be a good woman or a good man, and how those stereotypes still conflict for women with what it means to be a good professional. Because if you are really being raised on this idea that to be a good woman is to always self-sacrifice, to always put others above yourself or, you know, the community, to never speak up or assert your needs. And then you go into the workplace, you're going to have a hard time. But people who are raised with that expectation, you know, even if someone else comes into the workplace who was not raised on that expectation, if the boss has that expectation and a woman comes in and asserts herself, well, then that's what triggers the backlash against her. Nothing wrong with what she did, but with her boss's expectations that a woman should always defer to men and be grateful and not ask for more.
I feel like we're going back to the 1950s.
I know. It's so silly when we say it explicitly, but, you know, this is the kind of stuff that's playing out on a daily basis, and people are caught off guard because we don't talk about it happening. We feel shame, and we're so conditioned to believe that, well, we must have done something wrong if we get that kind of response. But when we see that it's not just us and it's happening at scale and it's happening across very gendered lines, then that really tells us this isn't an individual issue. This is a broader cultural problem, a cultural norm, these expectations of, you know, being a good worker, being a good woman, you know, how they're still in conflict. And it is silly when we expose how dated that is. So I think it's good for us to have more of these conversations, because I think it's an important part of holding these systems accountable.
Yeah, definitely. And we've discussed gender and age. You also touch on race and class.
Yes. So there's so many different intersections of identity, of course, right? So even as this book is really focused on gender inequality, what I write through is, you know, how does class play out differently for men and women? So one really interesting paper looked at what happens when candidates were applying for a large law firm. And what happens was for upper class men, of course, being seen as an upper class man is a very good fit with the kind of stereotype of elite law. But for women, those upper class women were more likely to be discriminated against, even though they had class privilege, because of a very strong stereotype of upper class women being seen as not committed to their careers. And so I think it's another one example of this thing where the same kind of identity characteristic that's going to be used to be framed as an asset for men, even if it's something that is an advantage in life. To be from, you know, an upper class is an advantage in your life. But in terms of how it plays out in the workplace, there's still this unequal response to it, depending on how it intersects with your gender identity. And then, of course, ambition is also very, very racialized, and context matters too. So one of the things I write about in the book is you can have men of different races or women of different races negotiating in certain settings and be rewarded for it, and in other settings, not so much. So one paper looked at pay negotiations in the Arab Gulf, and the women were penalized for their pay negotiations across the board, just like the other research we've spoken about. But for men, when they negotiated with local employers in the Arab Gulf, they were rewarded for pay negotiations. But when they negotiated with global employers who weren't based in the same Gulf states, they also faced similar backlash to women. So I think what this is really telling us is that this is about much larger ideas of what a certain environment thinks power should look like. And that is a very gendered, very racialized, and very all these other elements, class, sexuality, ability, all these other intersections of identity. Those are the things that inform the responses to our performance or asking or characteristics as expressed in the workplace, as opposed to something that, whole social classes are doing differently.
So how do we reduce these inequalities? Do we speak up en masse? Is that the way to do it?
I mean, certainly sharing and talking about these things more openly is a huge, huge piece of this. As I said earlier, that one of the reasons that people don't talk about it is because we've been so internal. We've been so conditioned to believe that we were the problem. And so one of the things I really hope that the data does, because this book is very data heavy, is help contextualize our personal experiences within the broader experiences of what is happening to all women or all women of color or other people who share our identity, and start to understand that it's not us. It's part of a collective bias against this group of people. And the best way to push back against that is not individually, it's together. And when we talk about it, we start that process of building community. We start that process of holding organizations accountable. And as I said earlier, we start the process of shifting from the internal to the external. What in the environment is really creating this difference? And in the book, I talk about what are those environmental interventions that change things. So, I mentioned pay transparency. I mentioned women in management. We talk about pay policy, paid leave policies and paternity leave. I mean, these are the kinds of things that really do make a difference. Remote work, having more flexibility over when you work, even if you can't have a remote job. If you're in healthcare and it's easy you have to be there, but if you can easily swap shifts with people, that still enables flexibility. So I think a lot of the call to action in this book is also for us to just be a little bit more creative about the way we think about our workplaces. And we can be, because we had to be during COVID, of course. And we saw how workplaces really shifted when they were motivated to do so. And that actually really did a lot to facilitate women's workplace participation, their ability to combine work and family life more effectively. And so I think we have a model for how to get started. But right now, unfortunately, we're seeing that backtracking of that instead of trying to push forward. And I think it's really important that we call that out before we start making a new myth that we don't know what to do, because actually we've already been here. We've already started the process. So I think we need to go back into that.
Yeah, very important. Well, if any of this resonates with any of our listeners, we're selling the book on our website right now, TRE.radio. It's called The Ambition Penalty. It's by Stefanie O'Connell, who we're chatting to now. And Stefanie, if people want to find out more about you, do you have a website as well?
I do. It's called tooambitious.com, and I'm on social media at Stefanie O'Connell.
Great stuff. Well, it's been fascinating chatting to you. I'd like to think we could talk again in about 5 years' time and we'd have nothing to talk about, but I suspect we'll still be talking about the same subject.
Hopefully better problems than these.
Yes, let's hope so. Let's hope so. Well, thanks for your time.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.